We've come to the end of season 3. I don't know where the last 11 weeks have gone. I opened with historian William Dalrymple talking about colonization and unconscious bias. I also heard stories from 80-year-old S.P. Raval and his memories of partition in India in 1947. Jude Hughes talked about not knowing his own identity and learning to fend for himself growing up in an institution in Ireland. Inspirational Kate Nichols talked of others' unconscious biases after she was attacked, while Anna Harrington shared her stories of adoption, racism and white privilege. These are just a few. I do hope you've enjoyed hearing them. I am ending with New Zealander Teremoana Rapley, whose honesty and reflection reinforces why I started this podcast series. Let me introduce Teremoana Rapley. So Teremoana currently works as a senior creative economic advisor for the local government in Cultural and Economic Development Agency in Auckland and New Zealand. She's a stalwart of the music industry as an award-winning singer-songwriter. She stepped into the industry at the age of 14 with politically conscious rap group Upper Hutt Posse and was inducted into the country's Music Hall of Fame in 2018. She's worked in indigenous broadcast for over 2 decades, gaining over 3,000 production credits as an executive producer and many production roles. Teremoana has also worked in a community action and development space for the last 30 years, with her latest co-created social change initiative focusing on intergenerational and intercultural place-based community building using the arts as the connector. So there's music, there's arts, there's her own personal history. There's lots of stories that I'm sure that Teremoana is going to share with us. So thank you so very much for sharing your stories of unconscious bias.
Thank you, Smita. It's lovely to speak to you.
So, firstly, unconscious bias. What do you understand by those 2 simple words?
So I had to spend a little bit of time thinking about this and actually researching it because it's something that I've actually experienced most of my life, but I didn't realize the name was called unconscious bias. That was the name for it. Mm-hmm. So my understanding is that it's a never-ending whole bunch of assumptions. It's another word for racism as far as I could tell, and that the context of which this action of unconscious bias happens is very important. It presents a space for the action of unconscious bias to actually happen, but also for someone to observe it. And I'm usually the person that's observing it, and I don't know if the word's offended. I wouldn't be offended by it because I'm used to this type of behavior most of my life. So it's actually...
There are a couple of things here I want to just get, because I really want to hear your stories and what that looks like in terms of most of your life. But you used another word earlier on when you were talking about the meaning of these 2 words and you were searching it, and you said never ending. And I thought that's really, I wanted to just flag that up for the listeners and for myself, because you're absolutely right. Because so many people around the world might think, oh, okay, unconscious bias, I can reflect and then that's it, job done, and I will no longer have unconscious biases. But of course that's not true. It's never ending because we're human beings and our life experiences will change all the time. And so I thought that was really interesting. But perhaps you can say, what does this look like then in terms of stories? What kind of experiences have you got in terms of your own unconscious biases?
My role has actually just changed recently. I'm now the lead strategist for the creative economy. And I actually asked for that title. So prior to that, I was a senior advisor. And the issues that I've been having with trying to carry out my work is that the difference between a senior advisor and a lead strategist, the difference between those 2 titles gives more validity to what I can actually bring to the table when I sit at the table. So you mentioned that I've been involved in music, and so primarily people in Aotearoa, New Zealand, recognize me as a singer and not as a songwriter, and someone that is sort of pretty in on the television set. And that was a very long time ago because I'm almost 50 now. So people have this idea of me being this young woman that they love to look at in the 90s. So when I sit at a local government table and I'm talking about creative economy, about things that need to change, sometimes the people that I'm dealing with, because they know me from this other life, they're not listening to me. They're not paying attention to me. They're actually usually singing one of my old songs in their head. And I will actually question them and say to them, are you listening to me? And they're like, there'll be a pause. And they go, yeah, we're listening. And the meeting will usually end in a selfie with them. So, and this is, and I'm telling you the story because I mentioned that to me, my understanding of unconscious bias is never ending, but also there are elements, and, you know, I believe it's another word for racism. But in the context that I'm talking about when I'm in my day job, the attitude towards me, it's not, I don't believe it's a malicious act. They're just taken away by something else and they're not actually focusing on what they should be focusing on. And so for me, unconscious bias comes in all sorts of levels, if that makes sense. Because the other end of that is also dealing with people who just, I've dealt with colleagues in the same organization that I work for who it doesn't matter what I say to them, and they might not know anything about me being a singer. All they can see is that there is a brown woman sitting at the table who didn't go through the normal channels of studying to be an economist, because I'm not. I'm a creative who has a large brain that's able to take in lots of information and spit out that information and make it make sense. And the role that I do, that I have to, it's about impact, but it's not so much about counting outputs. It's about the qualitative data that inspires a alternative way of thinking of how we can not problem solve, but pattern shift certain behaviors that may oppress or repress a certain group of people because of the color of their skin or their socioeconomic status.
So there are a couple of things here. Sorry, just to kind of, because I mean, this is really interesting what you're sharing. And there are a couple of things here that I want to just flag up for my own understanding. One, of course, is that because you were famous in the 90s as a singer, the expectation of you is obviously you're a singer. What can you be doing sitting at the table talking serious stuff about economics and so on? And it kind of almost reminded me of an interview one of my previous interviews that I've done with Miss England. And Miss England also happens to be an NHS doctor. And after she won Miss England, she was sharing a story about how she would go into the hospital to be working. And of course, they're looking at her and thinking, oh, she's just a beauty queen. What does she know about medicine? So I totally get what you're saying in terms of these stereotypical expectations that we have. And you, of course, had an extremely successful career as a singer. And you've just changed tack and you want to be seen differently. And that's really hard for the people who know you and loved you as a singer. But then you've got the second part of your story, which is about this brown woman. So now nobody knows who Teremoana Rapley is as a singer. And there is this lady who's sitting at the table, but they know she's not studied a degree in economics. And she happens to be brown, and it's a she. And therefore, what does that look like? And therefore, people's unconscious biases. So there are a couple of things here that I found very interesting in terms of how people can have unconscious biases. But I'm going to pause you there, Teremoana, if you don't mind, because I want to bring it back to you and your stories. Because I know these are your stories because you're at the receiving end. But what about you and your upbringing? I mean, by the fact that you're a brown woman in New Zealand, may I make an assumption, or am I wrong, that you're Maori? Okay. I mean, so can you tell us a little bit about what this looks like and your unconscious biases?
So I was on a indigenous, so the indigenous people of Aotearoa are called Māori, and my mother is from a group of 15 islands in the Pacific called the Cook Islands, and we also call ourselves Māori because, get this, we were related throughout the Pacific. Our language is the same. We have different dialects throughout the Pacific. And so when I was born and I grew up here in Aotearoa, and part of the reason also why people know me is that I was a television presenter for about 8 or 9 years. So people saw me on the television set. And I was on a show that was a bilingual show of English and the native language here in Aotearoa, Māori. Like I said, it's a different dialect. It's a dialect from what we speak where my mother's from in the Pacific, from the Cook Islands. So people naturally assumed that I was Māori from Aotearoa. And so part of that was, you see, for me, at the time, my partner was Māori. I had 2 children to him, so my children are Māori. And when the opportunity came up to be on this television show, I auditioned for it. I didn't realize that they thought that I was Māori from Aotearoa, and that being on the show for the amount of years that I was, so did the rest of the country. So it was a difference between Māori people from Aotearoa thinking that I was Māori, and Cook Island Māori people from the Cook Islands where my mum was from, also thinking that I'm Māori. So when I went back to the Cook Islands, I just naturally assumed that people realised that I was Cook Island because my mum was from there. My name's Teremoana. It's not really a common Māori name from Aotearoa. So I just assumed that when I went back, people would just be like, yeah, you're Cook Island, but they didn't. So one of the things for me when I think about my own unconscious bias is that I always assume that people's intentions are aligned and that their value system's the same as mine. And I get that wrong all the time. And that's actually been quite a valuable lesson for me recently because I work in the community. I work around community development. And when I get into those spaces, I do give a lot of myself. And I realized that I needed to, sometimes when it gets so hard when you're working with communities, that's just not ready. And I work in a manner that it's not about a hand out, it's about a hand up. So it's not a hand out, it's a hand up. And part of that is also having a level of self-efficacy for the people that I'm working with as well, because we've got to meet and it has to be a partnership. But for a very long time, I just keep on giving and giving and giving. It'll come on board. And I realized that at a point last year, actually, when my house started dropping, that I needed to pull back from it and don't just assume that everyone's going to get on the same page. It may never happen. And so a part of that learning was to align myself more with people who are like-minded and then work out a more rounded way, a holistic way for myself to be supported in the spaces when I work in community development. So it's a little bit of the assumption thing here.
And you said about values and the fact that just because you feel that your mum's from the Cook Islands, you know your partner and the father of your children is Māori, and therefore obviously this is who I am, this is how we're all the same, and therefore your unconscious bias is that we all have similar or same values. I find that very powerful, that phrase that you've used. What does that actually mean? I mean, I'm trying to understand that for my sake, in terms of, because you're saying you then became aware, or correct me if I'm wrong, that maybe those values were not as aligned as you thought. So can you expand on that in terms of a story? What does that look like?
Absolutely. So for in the local government space, the unit that I first joined had a focus on social innovation. So we get a lot of our learnings from the UK, from Nesta. We look worldwide for different ways to deliver impactful initiatives and programs that are human-centered for the people that we're actually developing for. So it's in partnership with them. And I assumed that my colleagues that I was working alongside with that worked in the community development space, I assumed that their understanding that the reason why we looked at social innovation, the reason why we looked at co-design is that we needed to have policies altered or new policies drawn up with faster. And this whole fad of people using the word social innovation, and especially in local government, got people all excited about human-centered design and stuff. But for some people, they say those words and they don't actually know what it means. And I assumed that when they were saying things like that to me, saying those types of phrases to me, that their value system was the same in terms of the urgency of the work that needed to be completed, the importance of the fact that the work needed to be done quickly because of the effect that it had on the people that we were serving. That's the assumption. And so I realized at one point, they have a completely different value system from me. Sometimes it's about them just elevating their own careers and moving forward and to be seen, to be doing this work that might be impactful. But I found quite a few times that I was carrying the majority of the work, and they were sort of, I guess a light analogy would be, they'd be taking selfies of themselves and going, hey, this is all this great work that I'm doing. And I'll just be the person in the background with my head down working. So,
I'm smiling to myself when you're saying that, but yes, I get what you mean. Yes.
Yeah. So different value systems.
I think that's really important for all of us, and because it's not just about, and this is my reaction to what you're saying, it's not just about your identity of how you see yourself in terms of Maori. It's actually in so many ways more than that. And I think people all over the world who are listening to your story, it'll resonate with them too. They will go into a workplace with X ideas of how things need to be worked out in terms of their value system and their narrative and their upbringing. And then they find that perhaps it doesn't quite match with the rest of the team. So there is certainly a commonality. But if you don't mind, I want to come back to you and your stories again. And this idea of the fact that you've always seen yourself as a Maori. And are you? I mean, is that confirmed? Can you tell us a little bit about any other assumptions in your growing up years?
Well, it's a funny story, Smita. Just before I turned 40, my mother told me, who's now passed, that my biological father was Jamaican. And now the man who brought me up, my father, is Pākehā or European. His ancestors from England. He's a white man. And so I grew up believing that I was half European and half Cook Island. I'm of a medium dark complexion, I would say. And so when the first time I was called a name, and I won't say it, pertaining to the way that I looked, was when I was around about 7, and I remember coming home because I remember talking to this kid, go, I'm not that. And this person goes, yes, you are. And they threw a couple of other names at me as well, other children. And when I got home, I told my dad. And he had to actually tell me when I was 7 years old that I was actually a different complexion. My skin color was a different complexion from his. Even when he put his hand next to my hand, I still remember it. I just kept on thinking, no, our hand, the skin color is the same. So as a young child, I didn't actually see color. And I'd grown up around, we call European people here Pākehā. So I'd grown up around Pākehā people my whole life, like my nan, my cousins, the area that I lived in. And so I was always comfortable in that space in terms of being around Pākehā people, because my dad's Pākehā and I assumed that I was Pākehā. And then when I found out that I was Jamaican, I actually had to look in the mirror and look at my face and look at myself. And the more I stared at myself in the mirror, then I realized actually I do look Jamaican. And throughout most of my life, because I've traveled around the world with music since I was about 15. People have said to me randomly in the most random places. I remember we were in Galway, I think it was, in Ireland, and an African woman came up to me and gave me a sarong and said, "This is for you, sister." And then she asked me which part of Africa I was from. I was like, "Oh, I'm not from Africa. I'm from New Zealand." She was confused. She's like, she doesn't know that she's black. But I didn't realize that I looked black to other people. I didn't even think about it. It wasn't, I'm sort of, my brain is utilized for other things that I think are more important. And so thinking about how I come across or look to other people, or people's assumptions, like I mentioned about the meetings that I have, and it's a struggle trying to get through it. I just focus on what I have to do. And so the whole question around the way that I looked wasn't part of any conversation that was happening in my head while I was going through these different things. And so these people would look at me and go, "Oh, she's so pretty." That's not how I saw myself, because I'm a tomboy. I would never sit in front of the mirror and did my face, because I don't wear makeup. I was like wear a cap, a sweatshirt, tracksuit pants, and a sneakers. That was me. And so I didn't realize that's how people saw me until a documentary was done on me about 7 years ago, I think it was. And these people were being interviewed, and they were talking about me in this light. And that took me, I had to take a step back and just go, what? And so I had to watch the documentary a few times, because this was the first time that I'd actually seen people talk about me and what they thought of me. And these were people that I knew as well, people I would consider my peers. And so this whole, the space that I don't allow to be occupied within my brain, really, because I just didn't think it was important. I had to actually start paying attention to it. On top of that, with learning about my Jamaican side, you know, I found my siblings, I found my father, and it's been a journey in itself. We're all in different countries, and I, apart from the fact that I can't get with them, I can't physically be with them, and my father has passed, I don't really have any other connections to Jamaica except for my siblings who live in America and Australia and the Philippines. Trying to get a deeper understanding of what actually that means. Like, I can say to people, I'm part Jamaican and part Cook Islands, but for me, the depth and understanding of what that actually means hasn't actually hit me yet. And I think that the more that I learn about my family, where I come from, will help set me in a better stead to it's not like I carry it and I'm ashamed of it or anything, but I know that I'm in a learning space. And so I'm still learning about who I am in that space. At 48, I'm still learning these things.
And you only knew at the age of 40, is what you said.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's only been 8 years, which is nothing.
No, that's right. Yeah, because for some people, it's a given that they know who they are. But I've grown up in such a what would you call it, a bubble and squeak sort of way. Just everything's sort of been thrown in, and then I've had to decipher it. And both my Jamaican father and my biological father and my Cook Island mother have passed now, and I have my siblings, and then just trying to piece things together. So even though I'm in I wouldn't say that I'm in limbo, but I'm treading carefully in the space of reclaiming who I actually am, and I'm trying my best not to let my ego or anything negative in the space, because ego can be good and bad, but I'm trying not to let any of the negative connotations, whatever they may be, to overrun the purpose or the reason why I'm actually trying to find out more about who I am and, you know, well, who my ancestors were. Recently, because my surname is Hendricks, and recently I started the search again, because all this time on my hands are between my job, and I found out, because I'd been chasing the Hendricks name, and there were different stories that I had come across, and sort of figured out from a DNA test that I'd done that our family came from Holland, and that they were Iberians, so Spanish, Portuguese, and they had traveled to Holland, and they were most likely of the Jewish faith. And so it's weird, but I actually was given a Star of David a few years ago, before actually after I found out, and this person had been to Jamaica a few times, and she just gave it to me, and I would wear it, but I'm not of any particular faith or secular denomination or anything like that. I'm not necessarily agnostic. I'm more of a Christian Hermetic Gnostic, and so being able to stand up and say I'm Jamaican Cook Island, I say it, but I know that there are reservations in my brain as well, because I'm still learning about who I am. And I think about other people who are born in Jamaica, other people who are born in the Cook Islands, and how they identify themselves as well. And for us here in the Pacific, our language is very important to connect us to our culture and who we are. It's part and parcel. You can't do one without the other. And for a very long time, I have been avoiding learning my mother's tongue. And that's because it was quite hard for me to learn it here. But now I just have to just pull up my big girl pants and just go out and do it. And regardless of people judging me, she's that singer. Who does she think you are? I'm just diving in and doing it. Because that's the thing for me, Smita, as well, is that I can't just have like a normal experience. If I'm wanting to learn something, there are always people that are watching me. As soon as people know who I am, and I'm not trying to play it or anything, it's just I've left a mark on some of these people's lives because there weren't that many brown faces on television. So when it comes to people seeing me, it's reminiscent of a time that was different for them. Now they've got kids, because these people would have been children as well when they were watching me. And so there's a sort of sense of people are watching you all the time, if that makes sense. And when I go through all these different learnings, and even what I post on social media, I always really think about what it is that I'm saying. So when I'm in spaces in public, I'm actually conscious of the space that I'm in, and that I can't just sort of, sit on the side and pick my nose or adjust my pantyhose in public, because you just never know. You know what I mean?
No, I mean, this is so moving, Teremoana, and I'm very grateful that you've shared such a personal story with all of us. The fact that at the age of 40 you realize that what was the phrase you said? I'm kind of paraphrasing, that most of us know who we are, and then you discover at the age of 40. I mean, think about that. I'm talking to the listeners rather than to you. I'm talking to myself rather than to you. But at the age of 40, suddenly you're saying, hang on a minute, I always thought I was X, and actually I'm not that at all. And then alongside that, the fact that you are very highly regarded, and people know you and people recognize you. So you have to be so careful when you say anything, because you are a person who is, what is the modern phrase they use, an influencer. And that when you speak, you might influence other people. So you must be so careful instead of metaphorically picking your nose or pulling up your pantyhose. It is so much more than that, because but I mean, for me, what's so moving is this idea about identity, and the fact that we all know who we are. Well, many of us know who we are, and yet somewhere along the line, and you're an adult and you're a parent, you have two children, and suddenly it's like, hang on, actually, I'm not that, because you had just created your own reality, despite the fact that when you were 7 or 8 years old and you were going out of school and children were being, for want of a better word, giving you racist abuse, you weren't allowing that to influence you anyway. Even when you were in Galway and they were saying, oh, lovely African, here you are. You're thinking, what's wrong with them? I'm just going to get on with my life. So it was almost like compartmentalizing, wasn't it? Your unconscious bias, when I'm talking about that, is about you're just putting yourself into slots. We all create our own reality. And that's exactly what you were doing. But at 40, somehow, it just kind of really came on the table and you had to deal with it.
Yes. Yeah. That's my entire life, Smita, is compartmentalization. Because, I grew up in quite a tough household, and hence why I left home at 14 years old to become a rapper. And I left the city that I lived in. I moved 600 kilometers away. So my lessons and my own value system, the way that I see the world, they've actually been self-taught. I didn't have an adult, because I was with a group of male rappers. I didn't have an adult around me who was guiding me in different ways. There were different people that I would see, but not really. I didn't have a role model as such to carry me. And I remember at a very young age, I was called a role model around about 19, because by then I'd been in the industry for 5 years. So people with, media were spotting me, pointing me out as a role model. And I remember saying in an interview, saying, I'm not a role model. I'm not somebody's role model. That child's parent, that should be their role model. This is me as a 19-year-old. And by the time I was 20, I bought my first house and had my first baby. And it sunk in even deeper for me, is that I'm not, my presence in the space we talk about as the industry, because I'm swapping between music and television here, Smita. So I'm talking about music here now, is that I didn't write politically conscious songs, or songs that talked about the skin color of my first child, or I didn't write those things saying, I'm going to change the world and this is how I'm going to do it. I wrote those songs because that's the way that I felt. Like everything that I do with my music, it doesn't have a there's not a disconnection, and it's just a focus on how can I market and get my music out. I write my music the way that I feel. And that's all it is, because my music is an expression of how I feel. It's an extension. It's not a to put it lightly, it's not a commodity to be packaged up, though that could happen eventually, but in a way that is more controlled from my side, as opposed to an industry infrastructure influencing and saying what I need to do. And that's what was happening when I was 19, when Role Model was put on me as a label. And, you know, they were trying to, the media and the industry infrastructure were trying to craft me into this person that they thought that I should be, because I was a brown woman. I was rapping, writing my own songs. I looked pretty, I guess. So I wasn't too hard on the eye for people. And there were issues around rap music back then as well. And because there weren't that many people rapping, but also there was an influence coming from America. And then when the whole gangster rap side of things started happening, it was like, oh, you know, we need to teach our babies better. And so all those things sort of got lumped on me as a young brown woman. And by the time I had my child as a young brown mother, I was like, actually, that's not my job. I write songs. That's what I do. And the person that I'm going to be the best person for is for my son. And so I actually have 4 boys, and I have 3 grandchildren. I have 2 granddaughters and a son. And my grandchildren and my eldest boy and his partner, they live in Australia, in Melbourne. So we haven't seen them for this whole year, you know. And for me, my main focus with me for my boys is that I just wanted them to be good men. And that was my main focus. Like, people go, oh, I really loved it when I saw you sing. Oh, that's really nice. You know, and I'm glad that people get that from me, and it makes them feel a certain way, and I hope that it's a positive experience for them. But
I think that's so beautiful, Teremoana, what you're saying, because the fact that you did not have a role model, and that you left home at the age of 14, and you know, because most of us firstly know our own identity and who we are, kind of thing, and the other is, you know, many of us, or most of us, would say we're the product of our parenting. You know, it's how we were brought up from 0 to 19 or 20, whenever we leave for you know, when we become grown up, in inverted commas. Whereas you left home at the age of 14, and so you are not the product. You are the product of your parenting from 0 to 14, but you are also, because you were so young, finding your own little compartments, creating your own rules for yourself without having adults, because I mean, let's face it, a 14-year-old is, from my perspective, still a kid, traveling the world, rapping, being famous, and other people having expectations of you. So there's just so much going on there. So Teremoana, how do you manage? I know you've kind of explained it, but for us listeners, how do you actually manage your unconscious biases?
Well, the one thing that I remember, this is a stark moment for me, a stark memory that I remember. We were in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, and we're driving from a stadium called Shah Alam into Kuala Lumpur, and I remember being on the motorway, and there were at least 10 lanes, 5 going each way, but there were no lines on the road. And I was so grateful we were in a huge 50-seater bus, because I was like, I couldn't even understand how people were driving. And here in Aotearoa, especially back then and throughout the 70s and 80s, and especially when Asian people were being seen more prominent, because I grew up in a place called Upper Hutt, and I was pretty much the darkest person in the whole town. Maybe one other person in the town centre. Maybe I knew 2 Samoan people who were also from the Pacific when I grew up, and 2 other Māori people. So it was very Pākehā heavy place that we lived in. But we didn't think, oh, we live in a place that's Pākehā heavy. That's the place that we grew up in. And when I was in Kuala Lumpur, the thing around the driving was that back here in Aotearoa, it was like, oh, Asian drivers are terrible. That's the thing that always came up. And we grew up thinking that Asian drivers were just Chinese people, nothing else. Because that's how our education system was here. When I came back and I realized that these different assumptions that I was making, that I'd been around, because I'm not really a judgy person, and I don't think I was back then either, because I was just quiet. My nickname was Mouse, so I hardly ever seen anything, but I did observe a lot. And back then, I thought, when I came back to Aotearoa, I was like, man, we just need to be quiet with the dumb things that we say about people that we don't even know about. You know, going to Kuala Lumpur was a complete eye-opener for me. The prayer that would happen, the Muslim prayer that would happen throughout the day, where everything would just stop. We were like, what is that sound? What's happening? Why is everyone stopped? And we realized that we're such infants in terms of culture and understanding the world, that from that point on, I was like, yeah, I'm just going to be quiet and observe everything that I take in, and not assume. So, you know, one of my best friends at school was, I thought she was Chinese. She was actually Malay, and she told me that she was. And so for me, I'd grown up with different people, and people were just people. So I don't know how I got to a point where in my mind I believe that, oh yeah, Asian or Chinese drivers are really bad. For my mother herself, and speaking of her own experience, she had her own assumptions about the way that people were. You know, specific people from different islands, Pākehā people, white people were great and fantastic, and Samoans were a different kettle of fish. And so I grew up with these things being said to me, but I actually married a Samoan. So whatever was going through her mind and whatever she's saying to me, it didn't attach itself. So, you know, I'm not a perfect person, but I do like to think that I am mindful and I'm aware, and that's how I think I manage my unconscious biases.
No, that's beautiful. I mean, it's about just being. You said you're quiet, you're silent, you listen, and you're mindful. It's rather than just jumping ahead and jumping to conclusions, which is so much an easier way of managing things. Teremoana, I am so appreciative of you having this conversation with me. Thank you so very much for sharing your stories of unconscious bias.
You're very welcome, Smita. Thank you.
This is the final episode of Season 3. I'm giving it a break for a few weeks to give you all a chance to catch up with some of the episodes you may not have heard. As always, I feel so grateful that I've had the opportunity to hear and make known such inspirational stories from around the world. If you have liked them, please do share, as it is only by sharing that more people can hear these stories. If you would like to recommend speakers, please do reach out via Twitter, Instagram, or my website, Tharoor Associates. Thank you so much for listening. I will be back with Season 4 in March.